Hello everyone. So in this series on los personajes importantes, that is the important figures, we are going to speak about Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara. We are going to look at them as two important figures of contemporary history of Latin America, and we are going to familiarize ourselves with the trajectory of their life, their actions, but also appreciate their intellectual thought and see how it is relevant for our contemporary world. Fidel, or as he is affectionately known, was born in 1926 in Cuba, and he died in November 2016, recently. And Ernesto Che Guevara was born just a couple of years later in 1928 and died very young in 1967 in Bolivia. Che, of course, was really young, not even 40 years old. Both of these figures, Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara, are two of the most extraordinary political figures of the 20th century, and not only in Latin America, but the world over. Both together led the successful revolution in Cuba in 1959, and then on joined the ranks of the tallest third world leaders and thinkers. Their commitment to building an equal and just society continues even today to inspire millions across the planet. Fidel and Che, met in 1955 while Fidel was in exile in Mexico and was preparing for an armed struggle to overthrow the corrupt dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista in Cuba. Che was then a young doctor. In the video on the Cuban Revolution, we have talked a bit about the expedition which Fidel and Che, took together when they met in 1955, preparing for this armed struggle against the dictatorship in Cuba. Che, as I was saying, was not really from Cuba, he was from Argentina, and he joined Fidel and his brother Raul on this boat called Granma as a part of those 82 Cuban rebels who arrived in Cuba a year later and waged a 3-year armed struggle, brought down the Batista dictatorship and built the first socialist country in the Western Hemisphere. Both these leaders embody an outstanding combination of action and ideas, and their political and intellectual thought, which is deeply humanistic and universal, is of immense relevance in the search for a better world. Fidel and Che, as I was telling you, are from different countries. Fidel is from Cuba, Ernesto Guevara is from Argentina, but their legendary friendship was born precisely out of these shared ideals. Che, he left us when he was very young. It was on October 9, 1967, that he was assassinated in the mountains of Bolivia by the Bolivian army in collusion with the CIA. After the Cuban Revolution, he had decided to go to other Latin American countries to continue the struggle for his ideals. Fidel passed away in 2016, surviving more than 600 assassination attempts, and the mortal remains of both these leaders, who were joined with shared ideals and shared friendship, both of them are buried in Santa Clara in the island of Cuba. In order to understand their ideas, I think it's important to look at their formative years. Fidel, for example, he was born in, as I was telling you, in Cuba in 1926 in a relatively well-off family. And in an interview that he gave to the French journalist Ignacio Ramonet, he recalled that one of the first grains of sand in the origin and the development of his revolutionary thought was the example of a young man from Spain, from Galicia. This 16-year-old poor young man, Fidel recalls, was recruited by the Spanish army and sent to Cuba to the War of Independence, which, as you all know, began in 1895. And who was this young man? This young man was to be Fidel's father. Fidel speaks of his father as a man with great willpower who learned to read and write by himself. He was the son of poor peasants in Spain. And as a part of the Spanish army, he arrived in Cuba and became a man with a sound economic and privileged position within the Cuban society of those times. Fidel greatly admired his father for his spirit of leadership and spoke of him as an enterprising man who did not stop no matter how difficult the circumstances were. And clearly, this is the spirit that Fidel also inherited. We see it all through his life and in his action. Ever since his school days, Fidel was very interested in history and international events. Let me tell you an interesting anecdote. So Fidel, as a young schoolboy, he was learning English, and he had heard a lot about, good things about US President Franklin Roosevelt. And so he decided to write a letter to President Roosevelt, who it seems even replied to him. And in his next letter to Roosevelt, Fidel expressed the desire to fight as a volunteer in the front against fascism. This was in the 1940. So this exchange of correspondence with the US president in 1940 reflects that Fidel, at a tender age of 13 years, was already political conscious. He wanted to fight against fascism, in the world arena. After finishing school in Santiago de Cuba, Fidel started studying law at Havana University, beginning in 1945. He was a brilliant student, a great orator and a successful athlete. He was the outstanding figure of his generation of students. During his years in the university, Fidel actually became quite active in politics, and he was even imprisoned. Young Fidel felt that the political situation in Latin America actually demanded a continental struggle. So in 1948, Fidel traveled to Bogota, Colombia, to organize the Latin American Students Anti-Imperialist Congress, which was organized to discuss the return of the, several issues. And one of them was, for example, the return of Malvinas Island from Britain to Argentina. The other was the sovereignty of Panama over the Panama Canal and against US occupation on the canal. They were also going to speak about against the Trujillo dictatorship in Dominican Republic. So it is precisely during those university days that Fidel developed his anti-imperialist Latin Americanism, which later would become the hallmark of the Cuban Revolution too. As Fidel has recalled in his memoirs, if you read his memoirs, I think they are entitled something like Fidel Castro, My Life. Fidel Castro, My Life, a spoken autobiography. And in these memoirs, apart from his political education, which we see that he acquired through such experiences of organizing these anti-imperialist student congresses, his participation in the Bogota incidents, he learned some essential things from revolutionary thinkers, above all from Jose Marti, the Cuban national hero who had died fighting for the independence of Cuba in 1895. The key moment for Fidel was the coup in Cuba by General Batista on 10th March 1952 against a legitimately elected government. In the lesson on the Cuban Revolution, we have discussed in some detail the miserable conditions of the Cuban people under the dictatorship of Batista, who held on to power with the support of the US. Fidel gave a call for rebelling against the military dictatorship, and he was joined by many revolutionaries, and in March 1953, they assaulted the Moncada barracks, the Moncada military barracks, which were a kind of a hated symbol of the Batista dictatorship. In the video on the Cuban Revolution, we have discussed this in detail, how the leadership that Fidel provided to the struggle against the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, how he led the armed struggle in Sierra Maestra, for nearly 3 years, along with Che Guevara and other leaders, leading finally to the triumph of the Cuban Revolution on January 1, 1959. After the triumph of the revolution, Fidel's ideas on how to build socialism in an underdeveloped country like Cuba are most important. Because if you remember, people like Karl Marx, etc., had predicted that socialism will become first in advanced developed country. But it came in 1917 through a socialist revolution in USSR. And of course, in the third world countries, one of the very first countries in the Western Hemisphere was Cuba. So the ideas, Fidel's ideas on how to build a socialist society in Cuba are of great importance. So he said that the future growth of Cuba must be based on the use of its human capital as an advantage created by the revolution. We have highlighted in the video on Cuban Revolution how Fidel gave utmost importance to education in revolutionary Cuba. Fidel advocated maximum investment in education. Cuba eradicated illiteracy within 2 years of the triumph of the revolution. Education from primary to secondary to university is completely free. The other aspect is the quality of education. Fidel emphasized on improving the quality of professors, teaching methods, and most importantly, he initiated the program of universalization of university education, meaning everyone in Cuba can go in for higher education. Now, this led to an exponential growth in highly trained specialists in all fields. So, Cuba has a well-trained array of doctors, scientists, technical personnel, especially in the field of biotechnology, molecular biology, genetics, pharmacology, all these fields. According to the UNDP, for example, in Cuba, the number of scientific researchers for every 10,000 inhabitants is 548, a figure which is much higher than the average for developing countries. And that is what Fidel meant by developing human capital. However, for him, human capital implied not only knowledge, but also and very essentially conscience, ethics, solidarity, feelings that are truly human, spirit of sacrifice, heroism, and the ability to do a lot with little. These are Fidel's words at a speech that he had given in 2005 in the Escuela Latinoamericana de Medicina, in the Latin American Medical College, medical school. So Fidel had, this kind of investment that Fidel, kind of saw as, investing in human capital to have these trained human beings who would help others, made Cuba give medical services to Latin America and other countries, because by the late 1990s, Cuba had a significant surplus of medical personnel, and these were also the years when Cuba was going through what is known as the special period. That is, it was a national emergency, because as we have discussed in the video on the Cuban Revolution, Cuba was a member of the Comecon, and after the fall of Soviet Union and the disintegration of the socialist camp, Cuba faced huge economic difficulties, and Cuba had to reinvent itself. And that is the time the massive investment that Cuba had made into human capital actually came of use, because this surplus of medical personnel was later became a humanitarian asset, and Cuba started giving medical assistance to many countries which were in need of such assistance. Fidel, for example, was the key person behind setting up the Latin American School of Medicine, the ELAM, the famous ELAM, which is just outside Havana. Actually, ELAM is possibly the largest medical college in the world, if you go by the figures of enrollment, which has approximately 20,000 students coming from about 110 countries. So it is really this idea of internationalism as well as looking at human beings, in order to develop them completely, that we can see at work at ELAM. Fidel also had an enduring bond with India and its people. It is important to underline that it was a bond formed through history and the context of the stellar role played by Cuba under his leadership in bringing together, in coalescing the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle across particularly Asia, Africa, Latin America. From the very beginning of the revolution, Fidel and the Cuban revolutionaries understood the importance of creating a new world order in which the developing nations would have an equal say. So, Ernesto Che Guevara was entrusted with the job of establishing contact and dialogue with like-minded leaders, and in July 1959, he visited India and met Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. India was one of the first countries to recognize Cuba, and in January 1960, India opened its diplomatic mission in Cuba. Just a few months later, the historic meeting between Fidel Castro and Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru took place in New York. What happened was that in September 1960, Fidel and the Cuban delegation, who had gone to attend the UN General Assembly, which was taking place in New York that year, they were denied stay in the 5-star hotels that were housing the various guests from different countries who had come to attend the General Assembly meeting. Now, this is in the context of the fact that Cuba was the very first socialist country in the Western Hemisphere, and after the revolution, the new government had taken certain economic measures which hurt the US interests, and so it is in that context that the Cuban delegation was not given any hotel, 5-star hotels to stay. And so Fidel said that he communicated it to the UN General Secretary, and he said that he had no option but to put up a tent in front of the UN building. However, the owner of the black owner of Hotel Teresa in the Harlem area, he came forward and invited Fidel and other members of the Cuban delegation to come and stay in this hotel. Fidel accepted the kind offer and he stayed in that hotel. And several dignitaries came to visit him there. The first one to do so was Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Fidel later told the former External Affairs Minister of India, K. Natwar Singh Ji, and I quote his words, that the first person who came to see me was Prime Minister Nehru. I can never forget his magnificent gesture. I was 34 years of age, not widely known. I was tense. Nehru boosted my morale. My tension disappeared. End of the quote. This important meeting between Fidel Castro and Prime Minister Nehru later consolidated into a strong and enduring bond during the heydays of the non-aligned movement. Fidel Castro visited India in 1983 to hand over the chairpersonship of the non-aligned movement to India. On its part, Cuba was one of the first countries to extend open support to the right of India to be a permanent member of the Security Council, which was announced by Fidel Castro at the Earth Summit in June 1992. There are various aspects, various facets to the relationship between Fidel and India. But one more interesting thing which might be of interest to you is that the Indian Amateur Boxing Federation, the Sports Authority of India and the Army Sports Institute in Pune have benefited from the services of Cuban coaches for boxing, athletics, volleyball and diving on a regular basis. And this coaching by Cuban specialists has helped Indian boxers win medals in various competitions. And all this was possible because of the warmth that Fidel personally felt towards India, and the cooperation between the two countries, which touches several areas of importance for both the peoples of Cuba and of India. So such was the personality of Fidel. Of course, it's very difficult to condense it in just one video, but I think it's now time to move on to the other important figure that we are dealing with in this video, and that is Ernesto Che Guevara. Ernesto Guevara was born in Rosario in Argentina on June 14, 1928. And since he was very young, he started traveling across Latin American continent. And these journeys became fundamental to his political awakening. And like Fidel, he also started, kind of thinking that if any change had to be brought in the countries of Latin America, it would have to be at a continental level. In the notes that Che made about his first trip in 1950 through the north of Argentina, he mentions that he did not want to travel as tourists do. And that is why, when he was traveling these places, he used to go to hospitals and places like that. Later, between the end of December 1951 and July 1952, young Ernesto Guevara, who was still a student of medicine at the University of Buenos Aires, along with his friend Alberto Granado, they went on their bike and, they traveled through territories of Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia and Venezuela. It was in these journeys, it was on these motorcycle journeys that Ernesto Guevara discovered the misery and hunger to which the oppressed people of the Latin American continent were condemned. From the miners of Chile to the lepers of Peru, he met so many people. And he recorded his impressions on this road trip in his book titled The Motorcycle Diaries, Notes on a Latin American Journey, which many of you may know was made into a film by the Brazilian director Walter Salles in 2004 and became a very celebrated film. In the preface to this book by her father, Che's daughter Alaida Guevara writes, and I quote from this introduction, she says, "My father shows us a Latin America that few of us know about. His awareness grows that what poor people need is not so much his scientific knowledge as a doctor, as a physician, but rather his strength and persistence in trying to bring about the social change that would enable them to live with the dignity that had been taken away from them and trampled on from centuries." So after concluding this grand tour of Latin America on his bike, which by the way was called Rocinante, Ernesto Guevara returned to the Argentine capital to finish his studies. In July 1953, he decided to go to Guatemala as he wanted to personally witness the struggle for social transformation in Guatemala, where there was a progressive government and President Jacobo Arbenz had been popularly elected in 1951. But this government, which had actually undertaken several agrarian reforms to benefit nearly 500,000 Guatemalans, poor peasants basically, it was brought down by a CIA supported coup. And Che Guevara, he had to move to Mexico because, as a foreigner he could not stay back in Guatemala because he was a supporter of Jacobo Arbenz. And it is in Mexico that he met Fidel through a common friend. The first meeting between the two lasted several hours, and from that moment, Che became the part of a group of Cuban revolutionaries who, later in this Granma boat went for the liberation of Cuba. And Che's participation in the battle for taking Santa Clara days before the entry of the rebel forces in Havana was a decisive milestone. Once the revolution triumphed, he took an active part in the construction of socialism in Cuba and carried out responsibilities as Minister of Industry, Director of Agrarian Reform Institute, and also as the President of the National Bank in Cuba. But he wanted to move on to other countries, so he went to fight in Congo and then in Bolivia, and that is where in Bolivia he was killed by the Bolivian army in 1967. But by this time he had already become a revolutionary legend, and he has often been compared to Shahid Bhagat Singh, as both laid down their lives for the cause that they held dear to them, as very young people, young men and with revolutionary spirit. The CIA and the dictatorship of General Barrientos in Bolivia wanted Che dead, as he presented a dangerous example of liberating the third world. But today, in the 21st century, Che continues to be a powerful icon, and his political thought is present in the contemporary social movements across Latin America. Che is often reduced to the image of a long-haired romantic hero, a Robin Hood, a nice idealist, always beautiful as though he's from another planet, and therefore, he cannot be used, he's not operative in everyday life. But Che was an organic individual, and his will to fight went hand in hand with his ideas. And he developed these ideas in several published works: the Bolivian Diary, Reminiscences of the Cuban Revolutionary War, Socialism and Man in Cuba. But even so, much of Che's writing is still not available to readers and researchers in India. Cuba set up a Che Guevara Study Center, and that is where much of this work is now being disseminated to the new generation. And there are a lot of photographic and documentary material which is available in this house, where Che actually lived from 1962 until his departure to Congo. In July 2013, in fact, on the basis of a proposal which was submitted jointly by Bolivia and Cuba, UNESCO has included Che's writing in its Memory of the World Register. This was created in 1997. This Memory of the World Register actually lists some of the most important and outstanding universal patrimony. So I will conclude by kind of telling you all that Fidel and Che were not only men of action, but they were also men of ideas, and it would be interesting for all of you to further look into their works. Thank you so much.